Hello, everyone. I want to thank Rebecca Vincent for joining me. She's with Reporters Without Borders, and you're campaigns director in the UK. Is that correct?
Well, it's a global role. I'm based in the UK, based in London, but I'm the director of international campaigns for the global organization.
Excellent. And you've been really strenuous work trying to gain access to the courtroom to observe the proceedings in Julian Assange's case for well over a year now. And it's become extremely harsh now as London has been put into a lockdown during COVID-19. So, uh, my first question to you is on January 6th, we had the denial of bail for WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Can you share your reaction to this and whether you feel this doesn't quite match up with the decision that the judge issued on 2 days ago on Monday, January 4th?
Well, we were extremely disappointed with today's decision. We condemn it, in fact, and have called it unnecessarily cruel because it is. So it is at odds with Monday's decision because the judge herself has now acknowledged the extensive mental health issues that we knew to be true. We knew this. We heard detailed evidence about this in September from a range of medical experts. This testimony went on for days, painting a very clear picture of a vulnerable individual who suffers from severe depression, PTSD, anxiety, a sleeping disorder, frequent suicidal thoughts, and has been diagnosed with autism as well. All of this has been compounded by his periods in detention. And even on Monday, in her decision, which until she turned to the mental health issues was actually really against the substantive points in his case, when she spoke of the mental health issues, she acknowledged that these had been present throughout his period of incarceration at Belmarsh, despite him having access to some means of support, such as frequent phone calls with his family. She stated that in court on Monday. And so today, for her to state, let me remember verbatim, she said his mental health was being managed at Belmarsh. So she's willing to let this possibly deteriorate there. And then she was also very dismissive of the COVID-19 situation in prison. She said that the prison management had it under control effectively, but that's not the reports that have been coming out for prison. We know that he's been held for several weeks now in de facto solitary confinement. He's been confined almost continuously to his cell with infections all around him on his block of Belmarsh. So again, on the physical health front, he has respiratory issues, which make him more susceptible if he is exposed to COVID. So there's physical health risks there too, but the mental health risks cannot be understated. And I think as well the fact that we don't know how long this could go on. We'll see if his legal team appeals this to the High Court, because the High Court could decide now to overturn the bail decision. But we don't know. She has the power to keep him detained until the appeals process is exhausted. And we, at the moment, have no indication of how long that will continue.
And I mean, generally, I have a question about the deference to the prosecution that's been shown by the judge. But perhaps before you would tackle that, particularly, it seemed that the prosecution hit a point that resonated with the judge when it came to the alleged level of assistance provided to NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. And I'm curious, as a press freedom organization, how you feel, because to many throughout the world see Edward Snowden as a source who was vulnerable to attack from a government that was hostile to his disclosures. These are disclosures that have garnered awards for journalists throughout the world, similar to the awards that people received for WikiLeaks documents and doing coverage about them. And so, how do you feel about the judge singling this out as one of the critical reasons why Assange couldn't be trusted to show up to his appeal date?
I think it's just evidence of the broader framing of this case. And one element of her decision on Monday that we really disagree with is that she dismissed that this case is political in nature. which it very clearly is. She also dismissed that it is about journalism. So these kinds of points were her attempt to paint him as not a journalist or as going outside of the role of journalist. And externally as well, there's been a lot of hang up on whether or not Assange is a journalist. To us, it doesn't matter whether or not you define him as a person as such. You have to look at what he did, why he was targeted, and it was certainly journalistic. His contributions to journalism are undisputable. The information published by WikiLeaks was overwhelmingly in the public interest, and that's why he's being targeted. So we always come back to the core of this issue, and everything that we heard from the judge on Monday, and in fact the substance of the 132-page extradition decision is overwhelmingly very problematic from a journalism and press freedom perspective, because it's these elements of the case that are why it's so important that we all defend Julian Assange. He does have these mental health issues. We agree with that assessment. We agree with the risks that he would face if extradited. We had called this a possible matter of life or death, and I stand by that too. So we agree with that assessment, but the rest of this decision was really disappointing. And I believe it's intended to further undermine the support that he has gotten from the journalism and free expression communities.
And then if I could just read to you a couple sections from the decision that was issued on January 4th, which stand out to me because of the way in which she makes her own determination that what Julian Assange was doing was not journalism. I'm just curious how you would react. So, for example, she spent quite a bit of time on the alleged computer crime.
Mhm.
And in it, she says something like, notwithstanding the vital role played by the press in a democratic society, journalists have the same duty as everyone else to obey the ordinary criminal law. In this case, Mr. Assange's alleged acts were unlawful, and he does not become immune from criminal liability merely because he claims he was acting as a journalist. So, all throughout this is this attitude that somehow Julian Assange is trying to appoint himself as an individual who is above the law. We also see this with the way that she attacks him seeking political asylum as
Mhm.
somehow flouting the law. How do you react to all of this?
Well, firstly, I would say the US government had ample chance to provide any evidence it had of these charges. I mean, we had 4 weeks of the evidentiary portion of this hearing in September, and it did not present anything to the court that categorically supported the allegations it's making about Julian Assange when it comes to this alleged solicitation of hacking. The US government has had 10 years to prepare this case. In fact, they had more time than Julian Assange to prepare, because they issued this new superseding indictment, which broadens the scope of that particular charge just before the September proceedings, to where he hadn't even read through the new superseding indictment himself before he came to trial, because he couldn't receive it in prison in time. It was that fast. They were infinitely more prepared than the defense on this, but they didn't present any categorical evidence that really showed that. It's also worth bearing in mind that that is one of 18 charges. The other 17 are under the Espionage Act. It is my personal belief that the reason the US government swiveled in a way to really put the emphasis on that one charge in the final stages was specifically to undermine any argument, any public interest defense, any sort of defense of him for contributions to journalism. I think they knew exactly what they were doing, and that's what they were attempting. I think that they failed. That's my view, because we haven't seen evidence that he in fact did solicit the hacking. The Espionage Act charges are pretty overwhelmingly indicative of how he has been targeted for publishing information in the public interest. And I think that has been one of the most alarming aspects for us all along, is the Espionage Act itself lacks a public interest defense. So anybody who would be pursued in this way would be unable to defend themselves. Any journalist, any publisher, any source. And we saw the Trump administration really misuse this law. We saw them pursue other whistleblowers with these same charges. So we've been advocating for reform to the Espionage Act, and that's something that we will amplify with the new presidential administration to come, and with the new Congress, because until that law is reformed, anybody else could be pursued in the same way. So this case was one of the potential, damning implications for everybody would be if a publisher could be persecuted in this way. Hopefully, if all going well with the appeal, he won't face trial on these charges in the US, but that's what's at stake there. And in a way, if there aren't reforms, this could have been just testing the water. I am firmly convinced that if nothing changes in terms of the underpinning issues, we will be looking at another case in the same vein, probably in the near future.
And also, do you think it's important for us to understand clearly what was attempted by the US government? Because the judge is also accepting something we heard repeatedly during the extradition trial that was contradicted by defense evidence, which is constantly the prosecutors tried to pretend that they weren't criminalizing the publication of information and they were just going after material that had unnamed sources in it or people who were informants. But as was pointed out, there are charges beyond just the specific ones that criminalize that. There are charges that go after WikiLeaks or go after Julian Assange for just any of the documents in general. So are you concerned that there's going to be a lot of education that has to be done on what exactly was targeted here by the US government?
Yes, and that's actually been the challenge in the campaign all along. Of any case I've worked on in my 15-year career now, um, this has been the most divisive, the most riddled with misperceptions because of these various issues. The more I've gotten involved, the more deeply I've worked on this case, I do believe that to be deliberate. I think that he was painted in a certain light specifically to undermine his credibility and to distract from the core issues here, which are about journalism. The nature of the charges certainly is about these documents, and we can revisit some aspects of the case. For example, the fact that that Julian Assange did take action to try to mitigate the risks to sources who would be named. In fact, seems to have done everything anybody could do in the situation. That he had worked for months with a partnership of professional media organizations to redact the information in the first place, and that publication was ultimately outside of his control. The fact that the US government has never pursued anybody else who published the unredacted information. There's all of these inconsistencies. It has very much been this punitive approach to him in particular, really a vendetta here to make an example of him. And the reason they have done that is to send a clear signal to everybody else internationally that if you publish information like this is what will happen to you. And I believe firmly that it has already had a chilling effect. This has been going on for 10 years. Few people on this planet would be willing to risk what Julian Assange has been through to publish stories that are in the public interest. So even if we don't see a situation of extradition and persecution in the US, the damage to some extent has already been done. And I believe that was calculated. I believe that that was the intent of this in the first place, was that deterrent effect on other reporting. So this, we won't know ever the stories that weren't reported, the chilling effect it had on, in particular, on national security reporting. And now all we can do is try to undo some of that damage. We have to campaign. We need to get him out of prison. We need to get the case closed here. That will require, I think, some political pressure on the new administration to come. And we need to take action to make sure that the underlying issues are addressed here to strengthen journalistic protections and make sure that this cannot happen to anybody else.
Yeah, like you say, I think it's going to be especially important because the person who's going to be president of the United States has being the vice president of the Obama administration, and a lot of the storyline of how the Espionage Act has been used to go against whistleblowers, then escalate it to be used against a journalist. Well, not potentially, it was with the indictment, but to maybe make it more of a common thing that the U.S. Justice Department would employ is something that I have some kind of responsibility for, having been in that administration. One that you've had constantly, because you're not, people made this, there's a different process for you than you're being invited on board as somebody from an NGO, right? Is that correct?
Yes.
And so you've had to deal with a judge who has rather hostile to allowing non-government organizations, people
Yes.
rights from organizations that are press freedom organizations. This has also impacted parliamentarians throughout Europe who have wanted to the case, who were not able to attend. Would you share some of the trouble that you've had with access to the case? You can talk specifically this week, but I understand that it's been rather intense for.
It has been extremely difficult from the start. So we have monitored throughout. We monitored the week of legal arguments that were heard at Woolwich Crown Court in February. We monitored the 4 weeks of proceedings, the witness testimony that was heard at the Old Bailey in September. We got in on Monday for the extradition decision, and this morning I got into part of the bail hearing. I got in for the decision part only. Today, the family actually put me on their list, and I should have been allowed in with no problems. But there were problems because, of course, there's always problems. So if we walk back to February, I think that's really telling because that was pre-COVID, at least pre-COVID in the UK. So that we sought accreditation as NGO observers then. We asked for reserved seats. The judge declined, and she has been very consistent in her approach to us ever since. She does not view NGOs as having any professional role there. She won't distinguish us as any different to the rest of the public. So she's made it clear from day one, and every time we write about this, it's the same that we can access only by queuing for the public gallery, which is always allocated on a first come first served basis. Now, because of the intense interest in this case, that means hours early. I mean, at most steps of the way, you'd have to be out there by about 5 in the morning to be able to guarantee that you'll get a space in any of the 3 courts that we've seen proceedings. So I queued personally in February. That was 4 days. So it was a bit miserable because it was winter and it was cold. And, they cultivated a really Darwinian sort of attitude amongst the people getting into the public gallery. So it was quite an intense and fairly miserable week. But come September, I would have taken that situation back 100 times over because at least there were more spaces allocated then. By September, we then had COVID restrictions in place. So the numbers related to access in the public gallery were severely limited. And we were able to get in. At the Old Bailey, there was an overflow courtroom that media could access, and there was a public gallery in that courtroom as well. So that is what we could access if we queued for hours. So you get in, and I would be staring across this big room at a small television screen, watching the same thing that you guys could see at home that journalists could watch on the cloud video platform. So I had to go through hell to even be able to watch, squinting at a distance, what you could see at home. We should have had access to that as well, but we didn't. And of course, you can't sustain that for 4 weeks. So how we got in was actually thanks to the kindness of grassroots activists who stepped in. The public stepped in where the court failed to recognize our important role, and a network of activists helped to queue and hold places because we couldn't do that every single day. But somebody was out there every day by about 5:15 in the morning to help me get in because they recognize this role, and we are so grateful for that because that was a real voice of confidence as well, that people could see that our observation was important and they wanted us to come out and be able to speak to the world about what was happening. We wouldn't have been able to do it without that support, but we did. But there was always something. It was constantly evolving. Barriers, like the goalposts, were constantly shifting. So there was anybody who follows me on Twitter will know all of these things that I've documented, including like these mysterious VIP seats that were held. It took me nearly 3 weeks to get some information about who they were, and finally found out that they were diplomats who then, it turns out, were unaware that these seats were being held for them. And after diplomatic intervention, then those seats were released to the public. But only between 2 and 5 people were allowed in at any stage for that 4 weeks. So we managed in the end, and we were the only NGO that fought it to do so. Other NGOs had sought accreditation. We were all revoked access to the cloud video platform. And so some others, including Amnesty International, wrote letters and complained, but we were the only ones that then fought our way in. Anybody could have tried it, but it took a lot of determination, I have to say. And then Monday, that was the culmination. Monday was horrible. It is really cold now in the UK. And Monday, we weren't yet in a national lockdown. We were under tier 4. So there were some restrictions, but you were allowed to be able to do your job. Like there's always an exemption for work purposes. So of course, this is my job. So I had every right to be there. We got out at, I was there by about 4:30 in the morning on Monday. Some people were there slightly earlier than me, but I got that first spot because my colleague had gotten there just before me. And police became increasingly aggressive because they're out trying to make sure that people are going home, staying at home because of now the COVID measures. I had to justify our presence at least a dozen times. Some of the police officers were very polite about it, but I had to really show, I had to show things like, for example, I had to show an email exchange with the judge. I had to show RSF press releases. And then some became increasingly aggressive. They were not accepting my NGO work purposes. They were fixated on whether or not people had a press card. And they were also trying to lump us in with activists that they viewed as protesting. I was not moving. I was in a queue by the door of the court. Then police started telling everybody that the public gallery would be closed and that we needed to go home or face arrest. The public gallery was not closed. I had to quickly email a court official, and she sorted it. And they did honor the first come first serve, access to the public gallery that they always do. But had I listened to police, we wouldn't have gotten in. So we finally got in. And then this morning, it felt too good to be true, and it turned out it was. The family actually offered to put me on their list. So I gratefully accepted today because I couldn't do another 5 hours in the winter battling police to even get in. So I turned up and they just didn't let me in. There wasn't even really an explanation given. And two of Assange's actual relatives were also, who were on the family list, were not allowed in. But at the final stage, a student who had queued since 3 a.m. stepped out to let me come in for the final bit. So I did monitor the decision itself. But again, it's always the kindness of the public that enables us to do our jobs. It shouldn't be that way. So we may actually file a complaint about our treatment by police on Monday. Some activists filmed parts of it, including there was a group of police who were very aggressive to me after the hearing when I was trying to do a live media interview on Al Jazeera. And somebody got quite a good video of that. So we do have some evidence of the treatment. There needs to be an acceptance that if there are proceedings like this taking place in lockdown, this is of the public interest, and there are journalists and others like NGO observers whose work purposes are this, and that we have a duty to actually scrutinize these proceedings and speak to the world about it. So at the moment, there's no further hearings set. The judge today, I believe this will be the last thing, if I'm not mistaken, that Judge Baraitser will rule on. She didn't set a date for a call over or anything like that, which would usually happen. So we are waiting now to see, I guess, if Assange's legal team will appeal the rejection of bail, which would then be heard at the High Court. And then we are waiting for the US government to move forward formally with its appeal. And at some point, we would have those proceedings. So we will stick with this however we can. On a personal level, I'm kind of looking forward to there being another judge to write to about NGO access. Somebody else would take a different position. I've never experienced this in the UK before, but the other hearings I've monitored here have not been of such interest. I've never had trouble usually I can just walk in because normally people aren't so keen to get into legal proceedings. But we've compared this to others I've monitored trials in several other countries for RSF, including this year. So COVID, of course, affects it. But even this year, under COVID restrictions, I've monitored trials in Turkey and Malta and had no problem. Our role as NGO observers is always respected because other states, even like Turkey's record on press freedom is much poorer than the UK's. Most of the time we're in Turkey, on really severe cases, there's dozens of journalists in prison in Turkey. And then I was recently there on the Jamal Khashoggi murder case, the Saudi columnist who was murdered inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And Turkish authorities, they don't like RSF. They complain about our work. But if we come to court, they respect that we have a role there and they accommodate us. I've never been treated so horribly, really like an inferior class of human here. Even just on a creature comforts levels, the things, especially at the Old Bailey, that we have to go through, it is just utterly exhausting. So I'm glad a little reprieve now that today is over, but unfortunately we still have lots of work to do while he remains in prison.
Well, I don't know if it will mean anything to you, but having heard Chelsea Manning's case, which was put on by the US military in the United States, and oftentimes people would have a harsh view of what they would do as far as access. I've constantly followed this and thought, wow, I wish the US military could come over to the United Kingdom and just run this case, because I had way better access, and I thought they were much more organized in managing media than this court. Just the disorganization. I mean, we almost some of at least half of press almost didn't make it onto the list for the extradition decision hearing because they were not on the initial email that went out with the deadline for when to sign up. And that may seem like just an innocent kind of bureaucratic mistake to people, but
Mhm.
it all adds up, and it's been this kind of slow burn effect that churns and churns, and then eventually people just don't have the ability to do their job that they're trying to do.
That absolutely, Kevin. So this is what I've been saying too. It's like some of this could be coincidence, some of this could be incompetence, but it has been so extensive. I don't believe that. I believe that some of it at least has been deliberate because it feels as if the intention was to make it as difficult as possible to follow these proceedings. There can't be any other explanation for the sheer volume of it. So I don't know. And I'm sorry that journalists have been through that too, because certainly that journalists' ability to access these proceedings is undisputed. She doesn't respect our rule, but the press has a very clear role. Everybody who wanted it, who is accredited as a journalist, should have had access at least to the cloud video platform. So that's completely unacceptable.
Yeah, and I do believe it was remedied. It just there was a panic because, a lot of these people act like they're unquestionable authorities, and if you catch them, it's really unclear who the watchdog person is that you can go to in order to have your situation remedied so that you're no longer frozen out. So I do have one substantive question I want to squeeze in here before you take off. And thank you for your time. I really appreciate being able to have this conversation. But I'm
Mhm.
also aware that there have been some issues in the United Kingdom over Freedom of Information Act requests for
Mhm.
documents specifically related to this case. And it seems to be part of an effort to conceal the way in which there have been backroom dealings or behind the scenes maneuverings in order to ensure that Julian Assange remained available for the United States government, and his associates potentially remained available for the U.S. government if they saw extradition. What kind of comment do you have? Because it seems extraordinary that there could be a future in which maybe there's a ruling that says people who aren't from the United Kingdom don't have standing to request documents that are sensitive.
So this is part of a broader freedom of information problem that we're having in the UK. So certainly there have been some specific applications to this case. I'm aware of, for example, Stefania Maritzi and
Yeah, that's what I'm referring to.
yeah, and Declassified as well. They have both sought documents specifically related to this case that have been their access has been denied. But this is a broader problem we're having at the moment. Open Democracy actually published quite a damning report about a month ago, uncovering this secret government clearinghouse that apparently exists now that decides how to proceed on FOI requests and actually attempts to shut down very sensitive requests. So they've started a campaign for transparency of freedom of information that we support as Reporters Without Borders. This also goes along with this government's broader approach to the media. We've documented a lot of issues since the start of last year, things I've referred to as Trumpian tactics of Boris Johnson's administration. So they started some behaviors early in the year before COVID measures were implemented that were eerily reminiscent of the early Trump administration, like starting to restrict the government press briefings, starting to pick and choose who could be there. This is all how Trump started before he then eventually shut down the press briefings altogether. So this tendency was there. Then during the pandemic, we saw this attitude of hostility really towards media increase among public officials. Um, there was this phrase almost being repeated by a few public figures, like you don't believe everything you read in the papers, don't trust media. That inspired trends online like scum media hashtags, and it was really concerning because then we watched from here the violence against journalists covering protests in the United States this year, the Black Lives Matter protests that started up. And we had some of those protests in the UK as well. Now, journalists covering that here also faced violence, intimidation, and threats, but not from police. It was from members of the public who were saying things like scum media. So this shows really that the actions, the words of public officials, they do bear responsibility for the climate that ensues. So their attitude then on these FOI requests is not surprising. It's part of this trend. So both the UK and the US are not performing how they should for countries that are supposed to respect free expression and freedom of information. The UK is 35th out of 180 countries on Reporters Without Borders World Press Freedom Index, and the US is 45th, which for the country of the First Amendment is really alarming. So we are, as Reporters Without Borders, working on these broader issues too. And I think that the Assange case has its own set of challenges. So and then, of course, the government seems to take particularly, has like a vendetta against certain media. We saw slurs earlier this year, like campaigning journalists and declassified. So one of the outlets that has been refused access to information on this case had found out they had been more broadly blacklisted by the MOD, right? So there's a few things going on here. The broader picture, the weirdness always of the authorities on this case, and then like their vendetta against certain media, which is kind of forming the perfect storm for a lack of transparency about aspects of this case. It's unacceptable. We're working on these bigger picture issues too. And I think the Assange case has to be viewed against the backdrop of these other behaviors of these states too. And the broader community that's working on those issues also must take up the Assange case more vigorously than they have, because it's all part of the same system here.
Yeah, and it is broader, and I think also within that broadness, I mean, I know we need to conclude here, so you can leave, but it was the fact that we did have a spying operation that has received widespread attention that was directed at the journalists who were visiting the Ecuadorian embassy, and that was allowed to happen on British soil to anyone who was visiting Julian Assange, which raises questions about what might be happening at any other diplomatic buildings where there could be sensitive things going on inside there. So thank you, Rebecca. I really appreciate you giving me the time to speak with you, and everyone. As we continue through this case and the appeal unfolds, it's really important. I think you should seek out Rebecca on Twitter and follow her updates while she is at the courthouse for the appeal and continues to do this campaigning work on all of these issues. I mean, outside of Assange, you're also doing things on important press freedom cases that deserve attention. So thank you again.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Kevin. And thanks for your diligent reporting on this case.